July 1918, and a new breed of pilot is practicing for a kind of warfare that has barely been attempted. They swoop in low to line up their targets, and they release practice torpedoes. For the newly formed Royal Air Force, this is the rehearsal for a seemingly mad plan, but history would show these men would be among the first to perfect a terrifying new weapon. In the early days of World War I, the German High Seas Fleet was a pesky, elusive, but extremely dangerous thorn in the Royal Navy's side. An ambitious plan was hatched to deal with them once and for all, not in a giant sea battle, but using a newfangled torpedo bomber specifically designed to launch from the decks of ships and attack the unsuspecting Germans in their home anchorages. It was an audacious idea, but it had simply never been done. No aircraft like this had even been seen before, and designers would have to work from scratch to help the Navy attack from the skies instead of the seas. The aircraft they came up with was the Sopwith T-1, elegant, purposeful looking. Design delays had seen the prototype hanging incomplete from the factory rafters, but by 1917, it was finally completed and ready for proper trials. But would the airplane, the ships, and the pilots even be ready in time before the war ended? This is part 2 in the epic saga of the first carrier attack aircraft. At the forefront was a very impressive machine, the Sopwith T-1, later named the Cuckoo. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Airliner Designs, and this is the story of how aircraft came to carry torpedoes from ships and the plucky aeroplane that proved it was all possible, the Sopwith T-1 Cuckoo. In August, a production order for 100 T-1s was placed, but even then, delays got the better of the poor aeroplane. The chosen firm was the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company, a highly experienced manufacturer of ships. As a kind of experimental craft, the T-1 had been assigned to the less experienced firm, which was put on the job to make sure the big production lines at the main aircraft factories, which churned out battle-tested fighters and bombers for the front line every day, weren't interrupted. Fairfield's production was glacial. August 1917 turned to September, then October, then November, December, January 1918. A full year after the order had been placed, in August 1918, the first Sopwith T-1 finally rolled off the production lines at Fairfield. That was bad enough, but a second order had been placed with the Pegler & Co. brass works. They, like Fairfield, had virtually no knowledge of aircraft construction. Pegler estimated they'd have a completed aircraft maybe in 1919. The poor T-1 seemed destined to be stuck in production hell. All the while, the war it had been designed for dragged on. But back in September 1917, the Navy and the Air Corps were keen to at least experiment with their new toy to see what it could do. The T-1 prototype flew from the Isle of Grain, 341 miles, nearly 550 kilometres northwest, to the Royal Navy Air Station at the village of East Fortune in Scotland. After landing, the machine was quickly pushed into one of the hangars, away from any curious onlookers who hadn't seen this new design before, and for good reason. Its very reason for being was still a well-regarded secret. In mid-October, the T-1 prototype arrived at Rosyth to finally touch the decks of a ship. There, bobbing at her moorings, was the mighty HMS Furious. By then, the battlecruiser had been the subject of a world first, when a Sopwith pup had successfully landed on her deck while the big ship was underway. Now it would be the testbed for the elegant new Sopwith prototype. The T-1 was loaded onto the flight deck, but once again fate intervened. Nobody had bothered to check the dimensions. With its wings unfolded, it was found that the aeroplane's wingspan provided barely any clearance either side of the ship's flying off deck. So much for that. Initial armaments trials pressed on. They began in December 1917 back on the Isle of Grain with the especially lightened 1,086-pound, 492-kilogram, 18-inch Mark IX torpedo. Developed by the Royal Navy Torpedo Factory in Scotland, the Mark IX was the first weapon of its kind to be specifically designed for aerial release. It was lighter than its ship-launched counterparts, obviously, with a smaller warhead and detonated by contact pistol on impact. But the armaments trials revealed that there were a few more creases to be ironed out. The Hispano-Suiza V8 engine wasn't quite cutting it, although it was more powerful than the old short 184 and smaller to boot. The Sopwith plane was proving to be more sluggish than its designers had hoped. The Spanish engine was diced and it was replaced with the untested 200 horsepower Sunbeam Arab, another V8, and incredibly it was decided then and there that all the T1s on the production line should have their engines changed as well. But with this change, designers now faced other problems. The thrust line was lowered by 6 inches and the aircraft was now found to be nose heavy because the Sunbeam was just a heftier engine. A large semicircular radiator was fitted directly in front of the engine. This had the unfortunate effect of raising the forward decking from the cockpit rim to the extreme nose, only making the pilot's visibility ahead even worse. The wooden tail skid was then lengthened to provide greater clearance for the torpedo's lower fin, but this raised the base of the tail to nearly 2 feet off the ground. The poor, inexperienced manufacturers received these amendments and probably responded, you can only imagine, with some choice language, but dutifully they began to change their power plants and airframes to suit. But the T1 was frozen yet again on the production line. But if the Hispano-Suiza had been disappointing, then the Sunbeam Arab would appear to be a disaster. The thing had a tendency to overheat and then shake itself apart with severe vibration. Some propeller shafts sheared clean off. Too late to revert the changes though, now it was finally time for deck handling trials. The object of these trials was to examine how much deck space a T1 loaded with weights, simulating torpedoes, would actually use on takeoff. The use of real torpedoes was thought to be too risky, and fair enough too. But they were also in short supply at the time, so instead the test was made, quote, with a coffin-shaped box in place of the torpedo, this gradually being filled up with lead to simulate different weights. The method of testing was conducted using an ingenious mechanical device that would record the speed the aircraft was travelling over a given distance. But then the unlucky T1 copped it again. The Sunbeam Arab was up to its old tricks and a propeller shaft broke off. Then a second forced landing by the prototype was made into a nearby field, and the trials were suspended. The T1, it seemed, was cursed. On June 1st, 1918, the first production T1 from Blackburn, the aircraft manufacturer who'd taken over Pegler's production contract, arrived at the grain test depot for a set of trials, but on arrival, fractures were found in the starboard undercarriage tubing. At the end of July, after repairs, the T1 arrived at East Fortune, a village with close proximity to the naturally sheltered inlets of the Firth of Forth in Scotland. With the formation of the Royal Air Force on April 1st, 1918, East Fortune came under that new service's jurisdiction, but the aircraft was still actually the property of the Admiralty. With the first production aircraft entering service in July 1918, a series of changes to the basic design were introduced, including enlarging the rudder by 2 square feet to counter a tendency to swing to starboard at full power. Later aircraft would incorporate an offset fin to actually stop that. But soon, in the midst of evaluations and fleet trials, the T1 got a nasty surprise. By then, it had been thought up some time ago, and the competition had tried to catch up. Short had developed their own torpedo bomber, the Shirl, and Blackburn had developed the Blackbird. The Short aircraft, with its wheel skids, looked like it could have been built well before the war, and the Blackbird was as ungainly as they come, that's putting it nicely. But the two planes had been designed and built after the T1's early torpedo-carrying experiences, and they pushed the dial. Designed by Harris Booth of the Admiralty, the Blackburn machine was, by far, the most inelegant in appearance, with the fuselage being the same width from the rudder to the firewall, giving the aeroplane the appearance of a flying coffin, not exactly a comforting thought for the air crews. Unusually, the Blackbird's cockpit was located roughly halfway between the main wing trailing edge and the fin. Well, not surprisingly, visibility over the nose on the ground was even worse than the T1's. It was virtually non-existent. Named by company chairman Robert Blackburn by simply changing the last letter of his surname, he had strongly hoped that the Blackbird would gain a production order because he was keen for his firm to become a key supplier of marine aircraft to the Navy. Thanks to their far more powerful 385 horsepower Rolls-Royce engines, both aircraft could log a bigger, heavier Mark 8 torpedo. With only one production aircraft at evaluation stage, the T1 was already in an existential fight for its life. not against German anti-aircraft guns or fighter planes, but against stiff competition. The battle was on. Even with that power deficit, Sopwith's T-1 came out on top, with East Fortune's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Montague, reportedly stating simply that the Sopwith is the type required at present. The Blackbird and the Shirl looked awkward and sluggish. Well, they handled like it too. The Sopwith plane could drop its payload and then fairly nimbly skirt around danger, but the Blackburn and the Short flew like bricks by comparison. As a result of trials at East Fortune with the Shirl torpedo aeroplane, wrote Montague, the unanimous opinion of all pilots is that it is unsuitable. It was decided Sopwith's T-1 would be the Admiralty's new torpedo bomber. Now came the torpedo launching trials. They began in early July 1918, and a T-1 was flown the short distance from East Fortune to the beach at Belhaven Sands, a good stretch of beach that was transformed into a kind of makeshift camp. A portable Bessonneau hangar was erected to store the T-1s, and small huts functioned as workshops. But the upkeep of the T-1 at the Sands was always a problem because supplies and the servicemen had to be brought in by road. Then, after the bumpy journey, the torpedoes had to be recalibrated. Meanwhile, the Marine section of the Royal Air Force provided small boats and drifters from the nearby Dunbar Harbour for torpedo recovery, but they would also play a crucial role in the tests themselves. As the T-1 roared overhead, the boats acted as targets for simulated torpedo runs, both at anchor and underway. Remember, none of this had been done before. Aboard, officials noted details like the name of each pilot, the speed of the aircraft, the height of the release, and the accurate track of the torpedo, and they snapped photographs of each run. Navy divers were brought on hand to help recover the torpedoes too, and in a strange turn of events sparked by that wartime expediency, some torpedo mechanics were actually trained as RAF divers. The torpedo plane was still something of a secret. Officially, although passers-by from the nearby town of Dunbar probably couldn't help but gawk at the big green aeroplane that was now zooming low down to drop torpedoes right into the sea. Reports were optimistic. "These attacks have been most promising," said one, "and on occasions of misty days, destroyers have admitted that they could not have stopped the attacks." In August, a special force was established in Hampshire back in England and given the deliberately vague name, the Development Squadron. They sized up 6 T-1s and ran tests to figure out exactly what the best drop height might look like. They found that dropping a torpedo no higher than 20 feet, and no less than 10 feet, at an angle of 3 degrees below the horizontal was optimal for a successful run. At too steep an angle up, the torpedo would ricochet tail first off the water's surface, damaging the rear section and the motor. At too steep an angle down, and the torpedo would dive too deeply. To be effective, it might even travel directly underneath the target. It was a very delicate balancing act. Clearly, the pioneering torpedo bombing pilots would need to have a deft hand. But even then, before the torpedoes could be deployed operationally from the T-1s that were now actually rolling off the assembly line at last, officials needed to figure out how to keep the torpedoes warm during flight. A heated torpedo simply ran better. Its mechanisms depended on heavy lubricants and oils. Warmer torpedoes had far less failure rates. But keeping a torpedo warm on the ground or in a ship is fairly straightforward. How on earth do you warm a torpedo that's slung underneath the belly of an aeroplane? Well, a simple, clever solution was reached that involved ducting the T-1's own exhaust gases near the torpedo, extending the airplane's exhaust pipes below the lower wing and alongside the weapon. An electrical transmitting thermometer was placed inside a water bottle inside the torpedo, and the pilot could control the exhaust output and maintain the warmth by examining a gauge in his cockpit. It was brilliant. Except now the engine noise was even louder. A silencer had to be fitted, which did dock the engine performance. It was an unfortunate side effect, but at least now the Germans wouldn't hear the T-1s approaching from miles away. The pilots probably appreciated it too. But then, tests showed the torpedoes became unstable when they hit the water. They had a pesky tendency to nosedive on impact, then porpoise up and break the surface. At the Royal Naval Torpedo Factory, trials were carried out to see if detachable wooden drogues, a kind of sea anchor, or anti-roll fins mounted along the flanks and the nose of the weapons would prevent porpoising. The drogues kind of worked, but the fins didn't. 270 practice drops found that a pointier torpedo might help solve the issue. In October, a proper simulated raid was mounted at last. 3 T-1s, fully loaded with 60 gallons of fuel and an 18-inch torpedo each, flew in formation for 80 miles, 128 kilometers, dropped their payloads, and then flew back home. The T-1 was finally proving a success, and they could remain airborne for a full 5 hours. Well, at last, the Air Force and the Navy were taking this thing seriously, and officials began to worry about secrecy even more. There were concerns about East Fortune's rather obviously named No. 1 Torpedo Training Squadron, and the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Montague, was upset. This secrecy is now being seriously compromised, he complained, by telegrams and lettering being forwarded from RAF depots and RAF offices at aircraft factories, with the word torpedo being written in full in the address. He issued strict instructions that the formation was, quote, to be referred to in all addresses and non-confidential correspondence as No. 1 TT Squadron, East Fortune. The word torpedo is never to be used in any address or telegram. He reminded his men that the success of the raid against the enemy fleet depended on the element of surprise. But the Air Ministry agreed and took it a step further. The trouble appears, they responded, to be due to an unfortunate name given to the squadron. We see no reason for calling these squadrons torpedo training squadrons, and TT Squadron is too distinctive also. Is there any objection to dropping the word torpedo altogether and calling this squadron No. 201 Training Squadron? No suspicion will then be aroused. So it was that 201 Training Squadron became the first actual operator equipped fully with the Sopwith T-1. 201 Training Squadron's men were a special select group. This was, after all, a very different kind of flying. Surviving logbooks suggest that the pilots selected for training were chosen to fly the T-1 because of their previous single-seat experience. They had to think very independently. Almost all of them were single-seat scout pilots, often coming off of Bristol fighters. Because the T-1 was a big single-seater, the pilot's first flight in the type was his first solo in it. There was no dual instruction version. If any of the pilots hadn't ever flown something as big as the Bristol or the T-1 before, they were first given a Bristol to fly so they could get used to it before trying the T-1. Still, it wasn't uncommon for pilots to misjudge their height and end up in the water. Fortunately, there were all those boats around for recovery, and even after 16 incidents that saw T-1s ditched, none of the pilots had been injured or lost. At last, in the autumn of 1918, there must have been great excitement among the T-1's early advocates and those like Beatty who were eager to see the German high seas fleet finally defeated. In September, HMS Argus, the world's first aircraft carrier with a flat flight deck, joined the Royal Navy's fleet. The T-1 finally had a suitable mothership, and a month later, on October 7th, No. 185 Squadron, the first aircraft carrier-based torpedo unit, was formed back at East Fortune and declared ready within weeks. But even after all this time in development and training, ready is a very generous term, because none of the pilots trained at 201 Training Squadron had flown from or landed on an aircraft-carrying ship. As if they didn't already have enough to worry about, flying their big airplanes loaded with a massive single warhead that they basically needed to temperature manage the entire way, they also now needed to pioneer the flight techniques that would see them hurtle down the deck of a ship, mount an attack, and then somehow come back. Maybe it was lost on the planners that ships, unlike the nice firm sands at East Fortune, move on the water quite a bit. But clearly everybody was keen to just get on with the job. It had been a plan years in the making. The plane was finished, and it was pretty good. The men were trained, and they had their ship. Now all they needed to do was set out, find the German fleet, and let death rain down from above. And then the war ended. On November 11th, 1918, the armistice brought fighting in Europe to a halt, and less than 2 weeks later, the pilots who'd been trained to attack the high seas fleet in their Sopwith torpedo planes witnessed their prey sailing sullenly into the Firth of Forth for their official surrender. In spite of their generally unkempt appearance, the German ships presented an awesome sight entering the mouth of the Firth. Aeroplanes and airships from East Fortune buzzed over the grey ironclads neatly sailing, line astern, into the broad stretch of water. Maybe some of the planes above were T-1s. The Sopwith torpedo plane at last encountered the high seas fleet, but it did so in an uneasy peacetime. Over the next few days, one by one, the ships departed and headed north for the isolated waters of Scapa Flow. 7 months of internment there, before their crews unceremoniously scuttled them where they lay in a desperate gesture of defiance. The high seas fleet was no more, destroyed at its own hand. There must have been a strong sense that it had all been for nothing. An East Fortune Christmas card from 1918 shows a picture of a T-1 dropping its torpedo and the German battle fleet streaming line astern in the Firth of Forth. It reads, "Would that we two had met. Our weapon, our objective, but the Huns surrendered." After a steady decline in activity since the end of the war, 185 Squadron was disbanded at East Fortune on April 14, 1919, without ever having fired a torpedo in anger. But the question has to be asked. If the war had dragged on, would an attack have been successful or an unmitigated disaster? Well, we know the men had never flown from or landed on an actual ship, but that wasn't the only big issue. By armistice, only 77 Sopwith T-1s had been completed, but the plan had called for around 120 of the things. The pace of production, in lieu of all the design changes and flip-flopping on engines, didn't even guarantee that an adequate number of the things would be available in mid-1919 either. Not only that, but the Navy only had 2 aircraft carriers capable of operating the T-1, Argus and Furious. The numbers just didn't add up. If the Air Force and Navy had pushed 185 Squadron to attack, as well they may have, this relatively small number of planes would have then had to have contended with the actual attack itself. The problem was that their approach on torpedo runs had to be slow and steady, about 70 to 90 miles per hour. It would make them really vulnerable to machine gun fire or even small arms, so the pilots would first need to lay a smoke screen ahead of each vessel before roaring in low for the attack. Incredibly, although the squadron had been practicing torpedo drops, they had never actually completed any kind of operational training. All of this was just purely in the hypothetical. It's fair to predict the attack would probably have been a disaster, with a good number of the T-1s ditching or being shot down, dud torpedoes bouncing harmlessly off German hulls, and a number of collisions, and T-1s brought down by machine gun fire and enemy fighters. One massive issue that was never resolved before the end of the war was what to do with the aircraft once they returned to the carriers. No work had been done on recovering them aboard ship, so it was accepted that the Cuckoos would have been ditched into the water alongside the fleet and then their pilots recovered. Well, this would probably not have been a very welcome end by any pilot after successfully attacking the enemy fleet, ending up in the freezing North Sea waiting to be rescued by a passing warship. The 185 Squadron men were dejected, they never got their chance to attack, but it probably saved their lives. Even so, the Sopwith plane had intrinsic value as a training tool and a testbed that was pioneering a new kind of naval aviation. It hadn't yet properly been named. It had been such a secret during the war that Sopwith had simply kept its T-1 designation. But with armistice, the cat was out of the bag, and the plane finally got to join the so-called Sopwith Zoo. It was named, affectionately and somewhat self-deprecatingly, the Cuckoo, and although the war was done, the plane's career wasn't over just yet. As part of the almost 20 years strong Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1921, 30 British instructors, including a handful from East Fortune, were sent to Japan to train a new generation of Japanese pilots in aircraft like the Cuckoo. At Kasumigara Naval Air Station, just northeast of Tokyo, Japanese naval aviators were trained by the British in the same torpedo-dropping techniques taught back in Scotland. Shipboard operations were carried out on Japan's first flat-top carrier, the Hosho, and torpedoes were dropped into Tokyo Bay. Little did the mission instructors realise the impact their training would have on the future world order. The Cuckoo lingered on for a while yet. The troublesome Sunbeam Arab was finally replaced for good with the Wolseley Viper, but the Cuckoo Mark II, as it was known, was somehow even more sluggish than the older variant. Plans were put into place for a Mark III, but by then, in 1923, the Cuckoo was just old news. It had been a pioneering game changer, but now, the rate of development was so quick it was soon outshone. Blackburn, whose Blackbird had failed those years ago, came back with an improved plane, the Dart, a neat machine with a big 450 horsepower engine. This was an aircraft for the 1920s, and the Cuckoo, well, she was a relic from the last decade. The Sopwith was finally pulled from service, and the Dart became the standard single-seat torpedo bomber for a decade. Soon, very soon, the torpedo bomber would have its moment, and those early advocates in this idea would have the satisfaction of seeing the techniques they'd pioneered put into action against the enemy. In November 1940, the early years of the Second World War, the Royal Navy launched a massed raid of Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers from aircraft carriers against the Italian fleet at Taranto. It was the first mission of its kind in history, and it was exactly the kind of attack that Beatty and all the others had thought up back during the First World War. The result was cataclysmic for the Italians. 3 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 2 destroyers were knocked out or badly damaged. In return, only 2 Swordfish were shot down. The age of the carrier strike had arrived, but it was a two-edged sword. British instructors had trained Japanese pilots in the art of torpedo bombing, while the Japanese aviators took to the task with gusto and spent the 20s and 30s practicing. In late 1941, they showed off their talent and devastated the American Pacific Fleet within the narrow confines of Pearl Harbor. But then, days later, the British warships Repulse and Prince of Wales, the prides of the fleet, were hunted down by hordes of Japanese aircraft and obliterated by wave upon wave of dive and torpedo bombers. The Sopwith Cuckoo was truly one of those amazing trailblazers that had to walk so others could run. It had survived shelving early in its development, suffered through teething troubles and redesigns, only to miss the war it was designed for and then go on to play a pivotal role in training Britain's future enemies. But it helped prove those early dreamers right. All the movers and shakers who had faith in the idea of a shipborne torpedo attack aircraft had taken professional risks in backing it and had lobbied hard, even just to bring it to fruition. Today, all that's left of the Cuckoo is a set of wings at the National Museum of Flight. Fittingly, this museum's located at a small town called East Fortune, just 6 miles, 10 kilometres away from the place where 110 years ago, men with iron nerves tested the world's first carrier torpedo aircraft.